Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 25 February 2024. It is the 168th anniversary of the birth of Karl Gotthard Lamprecht, who was born in Jessen in Saxony on this date in 1856. Before the Carr-Elton debate and before the Lovis-Blumenberg debate, there was the Methodenstreit, a controversy over method, also called the Historikerstreit. But Methodenstreit is also used to reference controversy over method in economics, which was loosely related to the conflict over method in history. And the Historikerstreit is also used to reference a controversy among German historians in the 1980s. So the most specific way to refer to the controversy in which Lamprecht was engaged was the Lamprechtstreit. Lamprecht was on the losing side of this controversy. He had taken on the establishment of German historiography, so his failure to convert the establishment isn't a big surprise. For us today, it's a little bit difficult to appreciate the conflict and its motivation. What Lamprecht was suggesting seems pretty tame to us because it was basically just social history and cultural history with some interdisciplinary aspects thrown into it. Social and economic history has become so familiar to us that we don't think of it as being in any sense controversial. It would not be inaccurate to say that we live after the triumph of social history, which is now arguably more central to history than state-based histories of elite activity. I touched on this in my episode on Christopher Hill and Marxist history because Marxist historians have been especially interested in social history and economic history. But we could make a distinction between social history that skews toward economic history and which therefore tends to be Marxist, and social history that skews toward cultural history and which is not necessarily Marxist, and Lamprecht belongs in the latter camp. At one point, Lamprecht received a favorable review from Franz Mehring, who said that his work fit well with historical materialism, and after that, Lamprecht was suspected of Marxism. Georg Igger's book, The German Conception of History, the national tradition of historical thought from Herder to the present, argues that Lamprecht stood outside the mainstream of the German conception of history, which he attributes primarily to the influence of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was the brother of the more famous explorer Alexander von Humboldt, and Leopold von Ranke. Iggers identifies three fundamental ideas or properties that define what he calls the German conception of history. One, the state as an end in itself, also called the primacy of foreign policy. Two, the rejection of thinking in normative terms in history, also called anti-normativity. And three, the rejection of conceptualized thinking, also called anti-comprehensivity. These ideas are all still familiar to us today. And in contemporary terms, we could call them: one, elite history focusing on states and state power; two, the rejection of moralizing history; and three, the rejection of any agenda in history, which Geoffrey Elton called thesis-driven history, with the alternative being thesis-free history. Perhaps Lamprecht's most significant difference from the German conception of history is his rejection of state-based history in favor of social history. We can understand the dominance of state-based history as an exercise in social cohesion in the wake of the unification of Germany from the North German Confederacy Treaty of 1866 to the November Constitution of 1871. So all these events were still fresh in the minds of those who were writing in the late 19th and early 20th century. A new and in many ways inchoate nation state needs all the help it can get to pull together, and it could be argued that Lamprecht's colleagues could be understood as contributing to nation building by furnishing the young German nation state with a national history. On the other hand, There could also be a social or cultural history that also contributed to state cohesion, and there are aspects of Lamprecht's history that could be construed in this way. For example, Lamprecht picked up and developed Herder's conception of the folk soul. Of the folk soul, Asa Tilton wrote in a review of Lamprecht, quote, Herder introduced the concept of the folk soul, and a new interpretation of history arose, the descriptive history of civilization. This disappeared with the ending of the first period of subjectivism. When subjectivism began to dominate again about 1870, psychology, economics, ethnology, etc., had established themselves, and with their help, and as a part of the same movement, a new and more penetrating social psychic interpretation of history appeared, that is, a culture history. Burckhardt began the analysis of psychic conditions by dividing the Middle Ages from modern times, a division generally recognized by the individualistic school, although with that inconsistency which constitutes its chief charm for many minds, it generally denies the possibility of a systematic extension of the method. Lamprecht is the first who worked out logically and applied systematically the principles of the social psychic method, unquote. Nietzsche was much less sympathetic and called it the damned folk soul, but it did eventually influence Lucien Febvre of the Annales school and eventually became transformed into the idea of mentalities, which was in turn further developed by many French historians of the Annales school. Despite being on the losing end of the Lamprecht strike, Lamprecht was not without influence, as we have seen from his influence on the Annales school, and he was a lifelong correspondent with Belgian historian Henri Pirenne. He even eventually became the rector of the University of Leipzig, and his multi-volume history of Germany was one of the best-selling works of history in his time. It isn't difficult to understand the appeal of this and how social history eventually triumphed in our time. Everyone who has disliked their history lessons in school, who has been subjected to the dreary triumvirate of names, dates, and places, knows the dissatisfaction with state-based history and the feeling of disconnection from it. In this sense, Lamprecht was the thin end of the wedge that would eventually lead to the dissolution of what Iggers called the German conception of history. This is also the least theoretically interesting part of Lamprecht's history, in my opinion. The more interesting part is Lamprecht's response to historicism and to Ronke in particular. Iggers argues for a close relationship between the German conception of history and historicism. As we've seen in previous episodes, however, everyone has their own definition of historicism, so we shouldn't use the term without first trying to give a sense of what we mean in this context by historicism. The kind of historicism associated with Ronke, whom I've already mentioned in several episodes because Ronke has been so influential, he is inescapable in the field of historiography, is a function of the second two of the three properties that Iggers attributed to the German conception of history, being anti-normativity, or the rejection of moralizing history, and anti-comprehensivity, or thesis-free history. This is in some ways a reductive account of Ronke's historicism. Ronke had been among the most influential of historians, even if his histories are little read today. And this is because it was primarily Ronke's method that was influential rather than his works that employed that method. Ronke viewed each era of history almost as an isolated and independent whole. And each isolated and independent whole should be judged on its own terms, and its history should be recounted on its own terms. The antithesis of this approach, to give a familiar example, is Edward Gibbon's Enlightenment history of ancient Rome, a history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon is continually interjecting the presuppositions of the Enlightenment into his account of Roman history, so that the Romans find themselves judged and their history told not according to their own standards, not by Roman standards, but according to the standards of an English gentleman of the 18th century. Ronke, then, is the anti-Enlightenment historian par excellence. The slogan that was lifted out of Ronke was, wie es eigentlich gewesen, which is usually translated something like the way it really was or how it really was. Ronke was just making the apparently banal assertion that historians should try to tell what history was like for those who lived it. And many subsequent historians and philosophers of history have noted that this is a rather unlikely slogan to serve as fighting words for a new school of historiography that's going to go out and convert others to its point of view, but it did become something like that. Lamprecht suggested that the task of the historian is not strictly descriptive, but should be analytic, and being analytic should even seek causes and laws. And he suggested that wie es eigentlich gewesen should be replaced by wie es eigentlich geworden, which could be rendered how things became the way they are, or to show things how it became so. He was effectively arguing that culture and society created the conditions for political institutions and not the other way around. So, in other words, Lamprecht was among the first to argue that politics is downstream from culture. Lamprecht increasingly focused on psychology and social psychology of history in his later work. And in his work translated as What is History in 1905, the German original is from 1904, he wrote, quote, "The full historical comprehension of a single change or of a single phenomenon with their historical significance can only be acquired from the most general principles, that is to say, from the application of the highest universal historical categories. These, however, are all summed up in the one great truth that the general historical movement, the meaning of the unity of history, is not to be looked for so much in the apparently important historical events in these occurrences, whose transmission through time and space is checked by the difficulty of unknown ways and unprepared forms, but in the liquid, as it were, ethereal elements, which are destined to influence universal history through long periods of times. These are the products of the higher intellectual activities, moral and religious principles, art, poetry, and science. These are the influences which become the chief constituents of the great stream of world history," unquote. In this passage, we can find hints of both a nomothetic conception of history, where he wrote about the application of the highest universal historical categories, and the hints of the longue durée of the Annales school, when he talks about the great stream of world history being influenced over very long periods of time, very slowly, by ideas. The current scholarly consensus over Lamprecht is essentially that his critics were right. Lamprecht was, they say, sloppy and careless in his history. He tried to do too much. He tried to cover too many fields in which he was unfamiliar and which were not his area of expertise. And this ruined his reputation among other historians. But it didn't prevent him from writing historical works that became very popular. And it didn't prevent him from being seen as one of the great historians of the day by the public. And we've seen this many times in history, when an imperfect attempt at an impossible task inspires both admiration in some and contempt in others. Could the task that Lamprecht set himself be done better today? Yes, probably so. I would argue that it has. Probably also we could say that it could be done even better in the future when we have a more robust conceptual framework for history, which can serve as a better guide to an historian trying to integrate a less familiar period of history or a less familiar variety of history into a great synthesis that exceeds the remit of any specialist or the knowledge of any individual. But the impetus to interdisciplinarity and the defense of disciplinary silos both have their representatives, and these representatives will continue to ply their trades for the foreseeable future. No one can master the whole that is history, but some will try, and Lamprecht was among those who tried. So happy birthday, Karl Lamprecht, and Thanks for listening.